We like to think that we are all safe, but since 9/11, the safety net we felt as Americans shattered, and we've spent the past 13 years hoping that the safety net is restored and even stronger. Just how safe are we today? Metal detectors have become a common part of airport security, which we all take for granted as part of what we need to do to keep safe. Among other things that have changed is here at the Forum Club, we haven't had to go to the metal detector route for Forum Club programs, but it was after 9/11 that we began to have a police presence at all of our events. Indeed, terrorism is the terrible T word that draws us here today to listen to one of the nation's leading experts on the topic. Following the terrorist attacks of 9/11, Tom Ridge was named by President George W. Bush as the first assistant to the President for Homeland Security. 2 years later, the former Pennsylvania governor became the first Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. The creation of the country's 15th Cabinet Department marked the largest reorganization of government since the Truman administration. Tom Ridge is CEO of Ridge Global LLC and leads a team of international experts that help businesses and governments address a range of needs, including security and infrastructure security. He serves as co-founder of the strategy advisory firm Ridge Schmidt Cyber, an executive services firm that helps leaders in business and government navigate the increasing demands of cybersecurity, an issue we hope he'll touch on today. Please join me now in welcoming Tom Ridge to the Forum Club of the Palm Beaches.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Gail, for the kind introduction. Thank you very much for your warm reception. It's a great pleasure to join you this afternoon. And before I share some thoughts with you, a couple of items of personal privilege that I would like to mention. First, I bring you greetings from the original speaker, who is my dear friend Louis Freeh, former director of the FBI. Lou asked me to remember him to you, to extend to you his best wishes for the holiday season. Some of you may not know that he was seriously injured in an accident several months ago. He's on the way to a speedy recovery. And I'm here to remind you that he's one incredible patriot, public servant, and a great speaker. So he expects to see you next year sometime. All right? The other point of personal privilege is that I'm delighted to be here as a private citizen. I counted the other day the number of government paychecks I received over my life, and it's quite a few. I started getting one picking up garbage in a state park. I ended up, my last one, being a cabinet secretary, and in between, being a governor and a congressman and a bunch of other jobs. It's been a heck of a ride. So for all you taxpayers out there, thanks very much. One final note that highlights my return to the private sector, which gives me an opportunity to speak with very direct and candor. By the way, when you're a secretary, you're not supposed to make news. When you're governor, you try to generate news, so you got to be careful about understanding. Now, as a private citizen, you can do what you want. But I remember my last night on the job, I was going to leave at midnight, and on my way out the door, the head of the Secret Service detail that provided my transportation said, "Mr. Secretary, good night and good luck." I got the good night part. I didn't understand the good luck part. My routine in Washington was pretty simple. Just about every day, early in the morning, I'd go down the stairs, hop in there was a car there, car in front, car in back, go down to the White House, go down to the Situation Room, get my DHS briefing, get the CIA briefing, go upstairs, wait outside the Oval Office, 7:30, 7:45, get waved in the Oval Office, a lot of people there, talk about terrorism. It could be a 5-minute conversation, a half-hour conversation, and then go about my business. But I always had a car. I woke up the next morning and realized I have no car. Well, I have 2 cars in the house. My kids have one going to school. My wife has another. Now I'm a private citizen on this particular day. I want to go get a cup of coffee. I want to walk through the Montgomery Mall. I want to go through the front door, not through a kitchen. And I'm just going to be enjoying the freedom as a public servant, of which I was very proud, but now I'm a private citizen. So later that afternoon, I have no car, so I have to wait. My kids come home from school, and I say to my son, "Can I borrow the car?" Tommy's a fine young man. He's a little bit mischievous from time to time. With a smile on his face, he said, "The car?" I said, "Son, I'm leasing the bloody thing. Let me have the keys." So he flipped me the keys and very respectfully said, "Dad, two things. Watch where you park it. And don't forget to fill it up with gas before you bring it home." So here I am. Thank you, Nasser, for providing my transportation and hospitality. Thank you very much. And of all of you at the forum, thank you for the opportunity to spend some time with you to share a couple of thoughts. And frankly, the thoughts I share and the conclusions I draw are as much a result of the tapestry of extraordinary experiences I've had in public service as a veteran, someone who understands a little bit about the legislative process. I've seen it from the executive side. And in preparation for these remarks, I thought back to those days in 1776, believe it or not, because I think Americans have a tendency to think we are an island and somewhat immune from what happens over there. But even back in the days of Revolutionary War, we had diplomats in Holland trying to get a loan. We had King George saying, "We'll buy your raw material, but don't sell us any finished goods, and we're going to tax you on the stuff we send." We had Ben Franklin in France trying to get support for our effort. So embedded in our history is our relationship with the rest of the world, both good and bad. And sometimes as I take a look at 21st century politics and the mindset of some of our politicians, I'm a little concerned. Because we have some that want to become economic isolationists. The market's global. I dare say to everybody that thinks it simply ought to be Buy American, I'm prepared to accept that if you divest yourself of everything you bought that has been made overseas. Be careful when you walk outside the door, because you may be not wearing very many clothing. And on the other side, there's these political isolationists. We can't get involved. That's somebody else's problem. It's not our problem. Well, at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that America has to be more engaged in the 21st century, not less engaged. That's the difficult reality that I think we must accept, because we're not an island. And our national security and our economic security depend on that kind of engagement. Selective for sure, but withdrawing, absolutely not. To that extent, think about the internet, terrorism, Brent crude, and Ebola. There's a common thread running through all those things. They're potentially global in nature. With many of them, there's both promise, but there's also peril. And it speaks to the interdependency that we have in the broader global community today. That means we must accept that reality, do everything we can to prosper and benefit by that connectedness, that interdependentness, but also understand there are risks associated with it. And we simply have to manage the risks before they manage us. Let's think about the digital forevermore. That's what I call it. It's the digital forevermore. The digital sun is never going to set. Quick anecdote. My children, as you are, and many of you in the audience, and regardless of your age, you're very sophisticated techies. I'm not bad, but I remember many, many years ago, I got a text from my daughter, and she emailed me back, "OMG, when did you learn?" I said, "Come on, Leslie, your dad's not Neanderthal. I can handle this." But think what the internet has done for us. How we're going to be able to accumulate all this data, synthesize it, and make differences in our economy and our agriculture and healthcare, and the list goes on and on. Think about the connectivity to customers, supply chains. Think about the productivity that can be harnessed. Think about the benefits. But flip it on its head. Flip it on its head. How do the terrorists advocate, proselytize, educate, They use the internet. Think about organized crime in different parts of the world looking for personal identification information. We can't necessarily say that we're immune from criticism because we have actually, as a country, used the internet to advance our geopolitical interests. We know that Russia used it in Estonia and Georgia before they moved in. We know both Russia and China have actually publicly talked about that fifth dimension of war, that fifth vertical. In my days in the 60s in Vietnam, it was air, land, and sea. Then there was space, and now there's that digital world. And we don't necessarily have clean hands from that world because of how we try to use the internet to slow down Iranian's nuclear program. So there's promise and peril in the digital forevermore. Think about the Internet of Things. 40 billion devices, all the good that can come of it. So technology can be used to advance our interest, hopefully raise the standard of living, healthier country, more prosperous country. So technology in the right hands is a good thing. Technology in the wrong hands is a peril. And one of the challenges I think we have, we talk about being safe, and they are connected because it's clearly that the terrorists have developed a sophistication that we've never seen before in terms of their use of the social media. But let's be careful how we use big data, too. We need to be wary of the tyranny of the algorithm. Technology in the hands of government is a good thing, but there's got to be limits. And then you've got to start thinking about privacy. And so while we worry about threats overseas, and we should, and risk overseas, I think regardless of how your political philosophy, what avenue that takes you down, we also have to say to ourselves, as an active citizenry, let's pay attention to how they're using all that information out there and make sure that it's used in an appropriate way by my government. You got that digital sun will never set. And frankly, the heat's going to get greater. By the way, nation states, organized crime, they have labs. They're a very sophisticated crowd. So you read in the newspapers like I do, Home Depot, Target, J.P. Morgan. So that's the world in which we live. That's the first challenge. That speaks to the interdependency. And then you go down to that's on everybody's mind. You saw the Taliban massacred, murdered kids in Pakistan yesterday, and the day before that we had the hostage situation in Sydney, and there's probably a day doesn't go by where some terrorist organization has taken its brutal mindset into an unsuspecting community and wreaked death and horror. Just like the internet, that is a permanent condition, I believe, of the global existence forevermore. It's a risk we need to understand. It's a risk we can manage. We should not be breathless about it, but we need to be aggressive about it. Medieval in their thinking, sophisticated in their use of the social media. The global scourge is something that will be a permanent condition of our lives. It was Al-Qaeda that brought the horror and the terror of 9/11 to us, but think about things have metastasized since then. It was just Al-Qaeda. They were in Afghanistan. We thought there's some in Pakistan. Now they're in the Yemen Peninsula. Now they're in North Africa. It used to be, we used to talk about Al-Qaeda, but there have a lot of similar organizations been spun up. But let's face it, it's Hamas, it's Hezbollah, it's Boko Haram, it's the Islamic Jihad, and the list goes on and on and on. The scourge is permanent. We're going to have to deal with it. I would tell you that, frankly, from day one, from 9/11 forward, we are linked up with the intelligence communities and the law enforcement communities globally better than we've ever been before. And the tragic consequence of the incidents in Australia, no one ever thought. Certainly Pakistan, the Taliban, and some of these extremists have been there a long time. Is just a reminder to the broader world community, if that can't bring us closer together to share information and coordinate our activity to suppress this evil, nothing will. The latest headline-grabbing group is ISIL. I happen to think that the failure of this government to make some critical decisions over the past couple of years created a fertile ground for ISIL to rise, but there's no sense in criticizing what we didn't do. But I'm going to tell you this, I don't think you can suppress evil with drones and missiles and airplanes. As difficult as it may be, and I think the toughest job in the world is being President of the United States, because there's expectations not from your own 300 million people, but there are expectations from leaders and citizens around the world. They pay attention to what you do, they pay attention to what you don't do. But ISIL is just the most recent manifestation, and I wish we could have named the war on terror a little bit differently, because terrorism is a tactic. Groups have been using terrorism, the tactic of terrorism, but really it's a war against a mindset. It's a war against a belief system, an evil, medieval belief system, embraced by a very small margin of people who have really perverted a historic religion, a very reverent, devout religion, and they justify themselves around their interpretation of the document. But the fact of the matter is we're at war against a belief system. And just as strongly as we believe in democracy, there's that small group out there that embrace that belief system, and it's a risk that's permanent, a risk that we can manage. Clearly, I'm sure we're getting into some questions whether we managed it correctly and if the CIA should have managed it differently, but the bottom line is it's out there, it's permanent, accept it, and understand that our relationship with most of the rest of the world around dealing with this threat is stronger today than it's ever been, and we'll have to sustain those relationships forevermore. You probably wonder why I mentioned Brent crude. It's very interesting. Our economic security and national security go together, don't they? People sometimes isolate both. You can't be a strong defense without a strong economy, and you can't have a strong economy without a strong defense. They are interconnected, they are interdependent, just like everything else. And the dislocation that could occur with the abuse of the internet, disruption of the financial services system, energy, the grid, we all know the horror stories. That's why we have to be on our toes all the time. And thank goodness professionals in government and the investment the private sector is making, we do a pretty good job, notwithstanding the recent revelations with some of the iconic companies. Demonstrates, frankly, you can be an iconic company, you can spend a lot of money, doesn't mean it's a fail-safe system that you're operating. Got to remind ourselves of that in the digital world. But Brent crude's an interesting one, isn't it? One time, what, $1.20, $1.30 a barrel? I didn't see the reports over the past couple of days. Is it down to 60, 65? The world's addicted to fossil fuel. One of these days we'll get around that addiction, but even to that extent, it reminds us of our interdependency, our interconnectedness. But it's even more interesting here to know that from old Econ 1, supply and demand, that some of the most significant suppliers of fossil fuel in the Middle East chose not to cut back on supply. Have you ever thought about why not? Because there are some countries out there, particularly one of the enemies called Iran, that needs about $110 or $120 a barrel in order to sustain its economy. The traditional Shia-Sunni battle, that's been going on, waged for centuries. So even when it comes down to production of oil in the fight against terrorists and terrorism in the geopolitical world, that element, fuel, energy, is a political instrument. It's all interconnected. And Ebola I've found particularly fascinating because Ebola was one of those, well, let me put it this way. Once I was in the White House and was sworn in and access to documents, there were several pathogens that we were worried about. Obviously, anthrax was one of them, but there was smallpox and Ebola and et cetera, et cetera. I'm fascinated by the fact that even though Ebola's been out there and we've been aware of it, the broader medical community has been aware of it, we still don't have a vaccine or an antidote to deal with it. And I think we're better than that. Well, I worry about the terrorist threats that I most worry about are perhaps a dirty bomb. Do I think we may see an incident that occurred like in Sydney or, God forbid, in Pakistan? Perhaps. We shouldn't be surprised if it happened. We need to make sure that the intelligence agencies, both domestic and international, give relevant information to the state and local so they can deal with in advance timely, relevant, and actionable information. And there are still some gaps in that regard, I will tell you. It's a lot better today in terms of sharing information of the federal government on down to local government, but it's not where it should be, in my opinion. Both in the physical world with regard to terrorism, in the digital world with regard to information that the federal government might have that could share with the private sector to make sure that they were prepared to defend against a particular piece of malware. But we're far, far better than we ever were in terms of information sharing. We're just not where Tom Ridge thinks we need to be. So you asked me the question, are we safer? No doubt about it. But the threat has extended itself. It's a larger, you need to put the threat in a context that is not a 9/12 context. There's been an explosion of these jihadist groups. So at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, I think, to answer your question more bluntly, this country has demonstrated time and time again how resilient it is. We're tough, we're smart. I've always embraced the notion that we have a brand in this country. And the product is America, the idea of America, an exceptional country. But the value system's the brand. And how you deal with the digital world and how you deal with terrorism has to be consistent with our brand. That brand is enshrined in the Constitution, it's enshrined in the rule of law. And whenever, even for the best of reasons, we deviate from that value system, we somehow try to convince ourselves that we can do things a little bit differently, then we have it. There's a risk of diminishing or denigrating the brand. What I found most interesting, ladies and gentlemen, I did a little travel when I was governor, but obviously had much greater interaction with leaders as Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. We are held to a higher standard than any other country in the rest of the world. We may or may not like it, but we are. I personally like it. I think we are unique. I think we are different. By no means do I think we're perfect. We'll never be perfect. We try every day. We're our loudest cheerleaders, we're our most vocal critics. But at the end of the day, how we use the internet, how we combat terrorism, really comes down to do it in a way that's consistent with the value and the brand of the United States of America. The latest dust up with regard to the CIA investigation, I'll wait, and I'm sure somebody's going to ask that question, have very strong views about that. But I look at this audience and I think, look, we've just assembled here. We're having this magnificent, we're going to have a great discussion. Very few countries have open discussions about government and politics and about values. That's who we are. Oh, we are safer. We just have to be eternally vigilant to make sure we continue to protect the brand, accept the risks as they exist, and do whatever we can consistent with our value system to deal with those risks. I'm reminded, when I get a chance, I'd love to tell this story. I was very proud to have served in the Republic of Vietnam way back when. But I remember going to a piece of volcanic rock outside of Hong Kong Harbor, in the 80s, and I went out because there was a Vietnamese refugee camp there. And I happened to arrive the day after a fisherman had managed to work his way through the South China Sea. I'm not sure you and I would have taken his boat across the pool, but it was nothing there, but he had taken his family, a lot of his family members into this. And I asked the interpreter to ask him why he did that. Now remember, in his world, if we thought of his world as ours, you'd say he didn't leave anything. But in his world, he left everything. Reached in his pocket, took out a yellow piece of plastic, took out a letter. She read the letter, gave it back to him, put back in the plastic, and he put it in his pocket. She said that was a letter. That was a letter from his son. Ironically, the son had managed to get to America before the father did. And the son was entreating the father to do whatever he could to come to the United States of America, because he said, "Father, excuse me, it's difficult to explain what America's all about, but there's some freedoms and opportunities here that unless you've experienced it, you can't really appreciate them. We're exceptional. We are unique. And we have to conduct ourselves in the digital forevermore and the war against terrorism consistent with that, because the world expects us to. The world looks at the United States through a different prism. I'm grateful that they did. I'm grateful that they do, and may they always look at us that way. We are safer, ladies and gentlemen. The risks around us are greater. We should not be breathless about it. We should empower those who can do something about it with the tools they need, ask them to do it consistent with our brand, and then go ahead and enjoy the greatest, freest, most remarkable country in the world. But we need to do it consistent with our value system and our brand. Thank you very much. Thank you. Question? All right.
Thank you very much for
All right,
being
thank
here.
you.
We know how busy you are. I understand you're flying out about 2 hours after our meeting today,
All
so
right.
we really appreciate you working us into our schedule.
Now, I understand I get the first crack at me as some students. Is that right?